I think that's why I'm such an advocate. I don't care if you're a homesteader or if you're not. We all need to have some reserves in our home in case that Y2K event happens for us personally. Hi everyone, it's Leah from Family Heritage Living. I wanted to talk to you today about the Homestead Pantry. We have been keeping a pantry since before the year 2000. You know, when all the hype about Y2K. Okay, remember Y2K, the big event where the computers were supposed to crash on midnight when we rolled from 1999 to 2000. The world was supposed to end as we knew it. So any of us that had been listening, of course, put a pantry together. And then nothing happened. You know, many of us were stuck with weeks, years, decades of food that we never otherwise would have put up. And what I learned from that concerning the Homestead Pantry is that even though there's not necessarily a big danger of the world ending, depending on how you look at it, I'm not saying one way or another. I'm saying that many of us thought, and I believed it, that there was going to be a big issue in the year 2000. But what we learned was that even though there may not be a huge catastrophic event such as Y2K globally, there can be events like Y2K personally. When we started to stockpile during that time, our diets were a lot different. The things we ate and how we ate. We ate a lot of food, fast food out. You know, I still made things at home, but we weren't opposed to stopping at McDonald's or grabbing a pizza. If I was in a crunch, you know, if things were in a crunch, we could buy a frozen food, a pack of hot dogs, or, you know, whatever the case. So it wasn't a big deal. Those things are difficult to put up into a pantry. So we did the next best thing. We thought, okay, well, you know what? Let's put up stuff that has some longevity. Like if you couldn't get it, like me, you know, a can of Spam, can of canned ham, you know, things like that. And what a great idea that it, you know, to have the ham and the Spam. But the thing that we found out is that since we didn't eat it prior to beginning our pantry, we never ate it after we began our pantry. So we learned some things the hard way through when we began our pantry, that if you are going to store food for any reason at all, and I can't emphasize enough, you do not have to be a survivalist. You do not have to be paranoid or, you know, a conspiracy theorist. You don't have to be those things in order to know that putting a pantry up is a good idea. We started before Y2K and we continued in that fashion. We went from, like I said, the canned hams, we graduated to the dried beans, and we learned how to store these things. And we found over the years so many times, especially with Ron's back history, that we depended greatly upon our pantry. Yeah, people would say, well, that's what the government's for. You know, if something happens, you lose your job, you get injured, you know, the government's there to help. Not everybody wants to depend on the government. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying that I'm not saying it's a good thing either. All right? When we take our independence away from us, we give our independence to somebody and we become dependent upon them. And when you become dependent upon someone else, then you are subject to them. All right? When you have the freedom or the ability to provide for yourself, even when times are tight, then you are definitely keeping independence. Now, I mean, here's an example. Putting up a pantry isn't necessarily just because you're afraid maybe you're going to get injured someday or you're going to lose your job. Though you might never get injured and you might never lose your job, but something major could come up. It could be, you know, an event with your house. Maybe you have to replace your furnace. Maybe you have to replace your well. Maybe you have to replace your septic. And for most of us, when we say we have an extra expense that we have to cover, if our money and our income is set, in increments, like one chunk goes to mortgage, one chunk goes to insurances, one chunk goes to, the light bills or whatever it is, that you cannot alter that per month, those items, but you can alter food. And most of us, when we find that we are in an emergency and we don't have a savings put up, that the food is what gets reduced because the money's got to come from somewhere to cover stuff. So having a pantry is almost like an insurance policy where it's there, it's going to provide. The thing you need to do, though, is you need to make sure you're doing it right. If you've never thought about a pantry before, stop and ask yourself, if I lost my job or if I was injured, how many days would I be able to feed my family with what's in my cupboard? And most people are going to find out that it's very minimal. And that's a very frightening, insecure feeling, to realize that you don't know where your next meal is going to be coming from. So think about the security of saying, you know what? Wow, I've got 3 months worth of food to feed my family. Or I've got 6 months worth of food. That if we're really crunching numbers each month to get bills taken care of, that I know that my family is still going to be able to eat and eat nourishingly. As I mentioned, as I gave the example about the canned hams and the Spam, you want to make sure when you start your pantry, and I don't care how you eat, okay? When you first are starting your pantry, put things in it that you already eat. If you're used to canned soups, then put some canned soups in there. If you're used to boxed macaroni and cheese, then put some boxed macaroni and cheese in there. If you're used to cereals, put cereals in there. You want to put things in your pantry that you know that you will eat, because it doesn't matter how much food you put up. If it's something you're not going to eat in the end, it does no good at all. Then you have to determine, when you start wanting a pantry, how long do you want that to go out for? Putting a pantry up can be very expensive. It can be very costly. Whether you can the good items on your own, whether you produce the items and then you put them up, if you don't have the materials, the jars, the canners, that can be pretty costly for a startup. If you are just going to purchase the food because maybe you don't like to can, or maybe you can't even grow anything in your area, maybe there's not a farmer's market for you to get the items, and you're just going to keep going about things and go to the grocery store, it's still going to be, it's costly. It's more costly than canning your own. So you have to determine what's realistic for you. Can you put aside, X amount of dollars each shopping week to put in the pantry, and you're not going to touch those items unless you absolutely have to? Can you find resources, tax return? Can you take your tax return if you get one and put some of that towards your pantry? It takes some mental figuring on what your way of eating is. And honestly, if you are a whole foods person, and I'm going to use the term whole foods, being that where there's no additives, okay? So if you, and I know that's not the proper term for a whole food, but we're still going to go down that road there. If it's something that you could go out and produce in the field, be it, you go out and you can get the wheat out of the field and you can grind it yourself. That's a whole food. Same with the bean. If you can harvest it and you can put it on your table yourself without having to go and add soy lecithin, vegetable oils, things like that, powdered cheeses or whatever. The whole food is cheaper than processed foods, but if you're not going to eat them, it doesn't do any good. But if you do already eat them, or you dream of transferring your diet from a processed diet to a whole food diet, this is the time to start, when you're starting your pantry. And that way, as you're learning to eat these things, those are the things you're putting in your pantry. Flours and wheats, beans, those all have long shelf lives if stored properly. Noodles, those all have long shelf life if stored properly. We've always used 5-gallon buckets, and I never found we had to do Mylar bags, and once in a while we do those absorbent packets, but we found over time that wasn't really even necessary for our location. That might be different for somebody else's climate, but for our climate, they worked fine without them. Now, when I say we had a pantry. I mean, we had a pantry. And unfortunately, I don't have very many pictures of that. I do have some, and I'll share the ones that I have with you. But when we would go to the bulk store, and these were things we made a priority. For an example, like if we went to buy wheat, we would do it so that we could buy 1,000 pounds of wheat. And if we were going to buy flour, we looked to where we could get flour for, to fill 20 buckets. And believe me, not all stores are able to do that. If you have regular retail stores, you're going to get that much. You have to go to the bulk stores, or you have to know somebody at the retail store that can order these things for you. And you can just, you pay for them when you go to the store and you pick them up. But they're not stuff that goes on the shelf. It's just additional inventory that they're ordering specifically for you. We used to, like Ron's a big coffee drinker. And back at this time, when we were stockpiling coffee, I was a coffee drinker too. So we would buy, this is before we were organic eaters, and we would buy these, the canned coffee, the pre-ground coffee. And the most I could do was a 2-year stockpile, because I could only get it to the shelf life, the expiration date, where, it wasn't really going stale anymore, by 2 years. And we had 2 years worth of coffee at one time that, it takes up room, and you have to find room, and you have to find room in the right area so that whatever you're storing isn't seeping up moisture. If it's cans, that it's not getting rusted, or if it's buckets, it's not wicking in the moisture from it. So we had to be creative because we didn't have a really big house. And so some of the coffee cans became our nightstands. We'd get toilet paper in bulk from Sam's Club, and those would create another nightstand. We put our mattresses on top of buckets. We had a pantry room that was 7 foot by about 15 foot. And I had one wall. I have a 7-foot wall of shelves for canning jars. Then I had another wall that had a 5-foot shelf on it for canning jars. And then the rest of it was buckets. And we had over 150 buckets at one time filled. And I know it sounds excessive to a lot of people, but the thing is we learned how to rotate this stuff. And because I had gone from processed foods and eat outs to all homemade stuff, I went through this stuff a lot, but in the process of storing these things, I learned how to store them properly. I found out that, glass jars are great for a little while, but if you're storing grains in the glass jars, that moths, if you've ever lived in an area that you have problems with moths, can still work their way through the lid of the jar. It takes some time, but they will work their way through, and they do. Moths don't care about sugar, sweet stuff. Bugs don't care about those things, of course, unless it's ants. Grains all needed to be in sealed buckets with good new seals or fresh seals on them. You wanted to keep things cool as possible to keep the nutrients in it, because when items are in a heated area, the nutrients breaks down. So you may feel full, but your body's really not receiving the benefits that the food can offer. I think it's important when we talk about food storage that we understand that everybody's in a different situation. There are people that, homesteaders and non-homesteaders alike, that grow beautiful gardens and raise, some small amounts of their meat, and they can everything they can, and it helps get them from one season to another. There are people that are homesteaders that maybe for whatever reason they haven't been able to produce a garden for themselves, or been able to raise the animals that they either have or wanted to be self-providing. Our situation, our personal situation, for reasons that are personal, or just that they're personal, we haven't had a garden for a few years. Between our move and having 2 young children, running a business and stuff, we've had to make some decisions. In the past 3 years, the garden has not been something that we've been able to do. And then, coming up here, everything on raw land, building from, scratch, that was a feat in itself. And the garden was the last thing on my mind last year. But now, I have a lot of regrets for not having a garden. I've been able to see both sides. I've seen where putting up a pantry when you're providing some of your own produce and your own meat versus trying to keep up a pantry when you have to buy everything from scratch. Now, for us, before we went GMO free and then organic, it was really economical and affordable for us to put a pantry up, and it was like this challenge. The more we could put up, the better we felt. But when we switched how we ate, we realized how expensive it was to put things up. And then on top of not having a garden the past few years, our pantry is depleted. And I'm here to tell you that that is a very uncomfortable feeling because we've depended on our pantry before in the past. And I think that's why I'm such an advocate. I don't care if you're a homesteader or if you're not. We all need to have some reserves in our home in case that Y2K event happens for us personally. A car repair. I mean, good grief. I can't tell you how many car repairs we've had in the past 2 years. And it's like each one it's a good chunk of change. And if there haven't been some resources for us to fall back on, it could be very very difficult. Not that you don't get through things, but it makes it more difficult. So again, a pantry is an insurance policy that as long as you're using it, rotating it out, and not just putting things away that you're never going to eat, it is one that continues to pay. It has to be a priority, though. If you're going to put one up, you have to prioritize. How important is it to you? Where can you scrape the money from? Do you spend money? I don't know. Do you go out and purchase, $50, $75 a month, and maybe things you really don't need? Do you have too much monthly entertainment bills? Can you do this to create a little extra income so that pantry can begin? Seriously, a pantry pays for itself multiple times over when you are able to put it up. So I think, this is like video 1 of a series that we're going to push forward to do on pantry prepping. Creativity in storage, because it takes up a lot of room. Right now, there is no way that I could have the pantry here in this cabin that I told you about that we had before we moved up here in the area that we did. I've got buckets under all the beds right now, and it's not even half of the buckets that we had. Because we didn't have room for them. We had to only bring up some of them. You've got to be able to have a spot to store stuff. You'll get discouraged, and you'll feel like it's in your way, and you just rather have it gone instead of dealing with it. So these are all things I want to touch base on. I want to touch base on, for those of you that prefer processed foods, and for those of you that prefer a whole food, the advantages to for me, I believe the advantages is in the whole food. But if you're not going to eat it, you're not going to eat it. Some ways of storing that stuff for longevity. We need to talk about, if you're buying processed foods, we need to talk about expiration dates. I'm not a big advocate of expiration dates. I think a lot of that is a fear tactic thing. But I do think that with the processed foods, because they do break down, and if you're gardening every year, you're rotating that stuff out anyway. So there's the reason I say, I don't really need expiration dates, because you're rotating it out. But if you're buying it from the store and you don't plan on eating it for a couple of years, you need to think about how is that food, because it will change. It will change the texture changes, sometimes the color changes. It doesn't mean the food's bad, but it does lose nutritional value, and the aesthetics of it definitely changes. So at any rate, if you guys can think of anything that you'd like to maybe touch base on, have me touch base on, if I have information on it, if I have knowledge on it concerning the pantry, if you leave a comment down below this video, I'll be more than happy to look at it. And if it's something I know about, I'll definitely share it. And in the meantime, we're just going to kind of future videos touch base on storage equipment, longevity, and possibly some recipes to use with your pantry. So hope you guys have a great day. God bless.